The ships came in at dawn. Not that dawn meant anything anymore. The power grid for the entire eastern seaboard of the West African Coalition had been dead for 18 hours. No lights, no screens, no hum from the generators, just the dark and the smell of burning from somewhere past the hills, and the sound of Vreth ships made a low, deep note, like a cathedral organ held down forever, getting closer. Sergeant Dara Ose heard it from inside a drainage ditch. She had her boots in 2 inches of water. She had 6 soldiers behind her who hadn't slept in 31 hours. She had a rifle with half a magazine left, a radio that worked sometimes, and a very strong feeling that the next 12 hours were going to be the worst of her life. She was wrong. They were going to be the strangest. The Vreth Dominion did not rush. That was the first thing you noticed about them. Every other threat humanity had faced came in hot, fast ships, loud guns, things exploding before you could process that things were exploding. The Vreth were different. They moved the way something moves when it has never once been surprised. Their ships arranged themselves above the atmosphere in a pattern so precise it looked like someone had drawn it with a compass. Their weapons didn't fire in bursts. They fired in sequences measured, considered, one target at a time. It was the most terrifying thing Dara had ever seen, not because it was violent, because it was patient. Sub-Commander Vrethkal watched the ground campaign unfold from the tactical deck of the Endless Precision and felt something he could only describe as professional satisfaction. Everything was proceeding within acceptable parameters. The human military response had been what his models predicted, coordinated, determined, and about 60 years behind Vreth weapons technology. The Coalition ground forces were fighting well. He respected that in the abstract way, that a man respects a river for trying to push back against a dam. He began drafting his occupation report. It was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph covered the military situation, resolved within 72 hours. As projected, the second paragraph covered infrastructure assessment, power and communications grids neutralized, civilian population movement restricted to designated zones. The third paragraph covered his recommendation for the occupation timeline. Standard procedure, 14 months to full administrative control. 3 paragraphs. Tidy, clean, complete. He saved the file and began reviewing the supply chain schedules. On day 3, Dara's unit was pulled back from the Eastern Ridge. There was no Eastern Ridge anymore. There was a smoking flat place where the Eastern Ridge used to be, courtesy of a Vreth orbital precision strike that had arrived without any sound at all, just a light, a pressure, and then nothing where there used to be something. They fell back to a food processing facility 6 kilometers west. It was a big concrete block of a building that packed and stored grain for the surrounding region. It smelled like dust and old wheat and machine oil. The roof had a hole in it from a Vreth strike 2 days ago, but the walls were thick and the basement was deep, and it had not been hit since. Dara didn't ask why it hadn't been hit since. She just moved her people inside. There were 14 of them now. There had been 22, 3 days ago. She didn't let herself think about that number. Not yet. Later she would. For now, she looked at her remaining 14, at their faces exhausted, dirty, holding together because they were too tired to fall apart, and she said, "Sleep in shifts, 4 hours each. I'll take first watch." Nobody argued. She climbed to the second floor and looked out through a crack in the wall. The Vreth ships moved overhead like slow clouds that had decided to have opinions about things. Day 4 started with Corporal Yusuf Addo having a very bad morning. Yusuf had been assigned to drive a fuel truck from the secondary depot to the forward command post. This was supposed to take 40 minutes on a road he'd driven 100 times. The problem was that the Vreth, in their infinite precision, had placed a series of communications relay nodes along the main highway, glowing holographic towers that sat directly on the road surface, projecting navigation denial fields that scrambled the electronics in anything that came near them. The relays were bright blue. The road was also bright blue. At 0600 hours, in the pale gray of a powerless dawn, Corporal Yusuf Addo drove a 12-ton fuel truck directly into a Vreth primary communications relay because it looked, from behind rain-spotted glass and a windshield wiper that only worked on one speed, exactly like the road continuing. The relay exploded in a cascade of light and sound that Yusuf would later describe as, like driving through a star. The truck went through the relay. through the secondary power housing behind it, through the signal boost array that fed into 6 more relays down the line, and came to a stop in a ditch on the other side. Engine still running, Yusuf still alive, covered in something blue and glowing that turned out to be non-toxic coolant fluid. He sat in the driver's seat for a long moment. Then he keyed his radio. "Command, this is Corporal Addo. I have a situation." Vrethkal received the damage assessment at 0621 hours and read it 3 times. Forward supply chain, severed. The relay destruction had created a cascading failure in the route guidance network that all Vreth supply vehicles used for navigation. Without the network, the automated supply convoys couldn't route to the forward positions. The forward positions had 3 days of ammunition and food. After that, they would need resupply by manual navigation, which would take 8 times as long and required resources that were currently committed elsewhere. Vrethkal sat with this for 11 minutes. It was an accident. His analysts confirmed it. The vehicle's navigation systems showed no evasive pattern, no tactical awareness of the relay's significance. The human had driven into it because he could not see it properly. He pulled up his occupation report and opened a new section. He labeled it Addendum 1 and began writing. Then he stopped. He wasn't sure what to write. Dara found out about the supply line at 0900 hours, when the radio, working one of its good shifts, spat out a clipped transmission from Coalition Command. Forward units were to consider themselves cut off from standard resupply for a minimum of 72 hours. They were to assess available local resources and adapt. Air resupply was not possible while Vreth orbital assets remained in overwatch position. They were on their own. Thud. Dara set down the radio. She looked around the grain processing facility, big concrete walls, a grain storage silo, mostly empty but not completely, the maintenance room off the main floor, the agricultural supply annex attached to the eastern side of the building, which she hadn't gone through yet, a workshop with tools that were bolted to the walls because the previous workers had apparently learned that people steal everything that isn't bolted down. She walked into the maintenance room, then she walked into the supply annex. She stood there in the dust and the thin light coming through the cracked skylight, looking at shelves of irrigation pipe, lengths of wire, welding equipment, bags of agricultural fertilizer stacked 6 high, and a collection of machine parts that had no obvious immediate purpose. She stood there for a long time. Private Kojo Mensa, 18 years old, from Cape Coast, who had been following Dara around like a confused younger brother since day one, appeared in the doorway behind her. "Sergeant? What are we doing?" Dara picked up a length of pipe, heavy-gauge steel, about 1.5 meters long. She turned it over in her hands. "We," she said, "are going to figure something out." It took 4 hours. It was ugly. It was wrong in about 6 different ways that an engineer would have been genuinely offended by. The pipe was too wide, and then they fixed that with a sleeve hammered from a metal sheet. The propellant charge was made from fertilizer and a compound the facility used for pest control, mixed in a ratio that Corporal Enyo Asante, who had grown up on her family's farm and knew more about fertilizer than was strictly useful in a military context, worked out by memory and instinct and one experimental test. Fire into the silo wall that left a crater the size of a washing machine. "That's too much," Enyo said, studying the crater. "That's perfect," Dara said. The thing they built did not look like a weapon. It looked like an agricultural pipe with bad decisions attached to it. It had a bipod made from rebent fence posts. The firing mechanism was a modified pressure valve from the building's irrigation control system. The first round they loaded was a steel cap packed with the propellant mix and welded shut by Corporal Amara Owusu, who had worked in a car repair shop before the war and whose welds were, under the circumstances, surprisingly solid. They carried it to the roof. 3 kilometers to the north, on the main road, a column of 4 Vreth armored vehicles was moving south. They moved with the same patient, measured pace as everything else the Vreth did. Precise spacing, precise speed, comfortable in the knowledge that nothing between here and their destination was capable of threatening them. Dara looked at the column. She looked at the pipe. She looked at Enyo. "Elevation?" she said. Enyo did the calculation in her head, using formulas from physics class and memory, and a kind of desperate mathematics that doesn't have a formal name, but that humans have been doing since the first person threw the first rock, at the first problem they couldn't solve. Any other way, Try 30 degrees, Enyo said. Maybe. Maybe, Dara repeated. She adjusted the angle. She fired. The round went wide by 40 meters on the first shot. It still landed close enough to a Vreth vehicle to make it swerve off the road and into the embankment. The column stopped. They had about 90 seconds before the Vreth figured out where the shot had come from and responded. Adjust, Dara said. Enyo adjusted. 32 degrees. The sleeve on the firing chamber was getting hot. The improvised bipod was bending slightly to the left under the weight. None of these things were acceptable engineering realities. All of them were currently irrelevant. Second shot. It hit the lead vehicle directly on the upper deck. The explosion was bigger than any of them expected. Bigger than the crater in the silo wall by a significant amount, which suggested that the Vreth armored vehicles stored their power cells in the upper deck, which was useful information that Dara filed away in the back of her mind while the fireball was still expanding. Third shot. The column was already braking vehicles trying to scatter. Navigation confused. The measured Vreth patience cracking in the heat of something that shouldn't be happening. Third shot hit the rear vehicle. Then Dara said move, and all 14 of them left the roof and went down through the building and out the back and into the drainage network before the Vreth response strike hit the facility's roof and turned the top floor into rubble. The walls held. The basement held. The improvised mortar was still intact because they'd taken it with them. They sat in the dark in the basement while the building shook above them. Private Kojo, covered in dust, looked at the pipe. We built that, he said. It wasn't a proud statement. It was more like he was trying to make the fact feel real. We built that, Dara said. The damage assessment reached Vrethkal at 1,400 hours. 3 armored vehicles destroyed, 1 disabled. Combined crew losses significant. The attack had come from the grain processing facility, now partially destroyed by the response strike. No survivors identified at the target site, which likely meant the attackers had evacuated before the strike, which meant they still had their weapon system. Vrethkal read the part about the weapon 3 times. His analysts had identified the propellant residue from the impact craters, nitrogen compound fertilizer, agricultural-grade pest control additive. The delivery mechanism appeared to be a steel pipe industrial, water or irrigation grade, fired from an improvised mounting at an elevated position. He opened Addendum 1. He started writing. He wrote 2 sentences and stopped again. The problem was that the weapon his analysts were describing was not a weapon. It was a pipe and some agricultural chemicals. These things were in essentially every farm building on this planet, every grain storage facility, every rural infrastructure site. They had not thought to target grain storage facilities. Why would you target grain storage facilities? They had no military value. He stared at the sensor image of the impact crater on the lead vehicle. Then he looked up the specifications of that vehicle. It was among the most heavily armored transport units in the Vreth forward fleet. The upper deck shielding was rated to withstand direct fire from Coalition standard heavy weapons. It was not rated to withstand what had hit it, because what had hit it was a steel pipe cap full of fertilizer and pest control chemicals, which was not a weapon, which was not in the rating parameters, which meant the shield rating was technically accurate and completely meaningless at the same time. He opened a new section beneath Addendum 1. He wrote, Addendum 2. Request assessment of all agricultural facilities within 80-kilometer radius of forward positions. Recommend elevated threat classification. He paused. He wrote, also request clarification on what a weapon is, exactly, and whether that classification has a lower limit. He saved the file. He sat in his chair on the deck of the Endless Precision and looked out at the planet below and felt, for the first time in his 17 years of service, that his 3-paragraph report was not going to be enough. That night, in the basement, Dara sat with her back against the wall and looked at the pipe. It was leaning against the far wall, cooling down. The weld on the firing chamber had held through 3 shots, which was 2 more than Enyo had quietly expected. The bipod was bent. The pressure valve was scorched. The whole thing looked like something you'd find in a skip outside a building site. It had destroyed 2 Vreth armored vehicles. Kojo was asleep. Enyo was asleep. The others were asleep or close to it. The radio was quiet. Outside, somewhere, The Vreth were regrouping and doing whatever Vreth did when something happened that didn't fit their models. Dara thought about the column, the way the first vehicle had swerved, the way the explosion had been bigger than expected, the way the column that patient, measured, precise Vreth column had broken, had scattered, had been, for 90 seconds, exactly as confused as humans had been for 3 days. It felt like something. She wasn't sure what. Not victory. Not quite. More like a door opening into a room she didn't know was there. She thought about the annex, the shelves, the pipe. She thought about how many grain facilities there were in the coalition. How many farms. How many maintenance buildings with tool walls and irrigation parts and bags of fertilizer, stacked 6 high. The Vreth had precision weapons. Perfect, classified, optimized tools for every scenario they'd ever encountered before. They did not have a scenario for this. She pulled her notebook out of her vest pocket, found a pen, wrote a single question at the top of the page. What else is in the building? Underneath it, she started to list. She wrote for 2 hours. When she ran out of room on the first page, she flipped to the second. The list got longer. Some of the items had question marks next to them. She wasn't sure yet what they could do. But she was starting to think in a particular way now. A way she hadn't thought before. And once you start thinking that way, it is very hard to stop. She looked at the pipe one more time. Then she looked back at her list. Outside, the Vreth organ note continued, low and patient, across the sky. Below it, in a cracked concrete basement, next to an improvised weapon made from irrigation parts and farm chemicals, a sergeant who had not slept in 35 hours was making plans that nobody in the history of interstellar warfare had ever needed to make before. She did not feel like a hero. She felt like a person who had looked at what was available and decided it would have to be enough. It was enough. For now, it was enough. Vrethkal's 3-paragraph report, by the end of day 4, had grown to 11 pages. He suspected it was going to get longer. He was right. Chief Analyst Vrethsen had classified 847 weapon systems in her career. She was considered the best in the Dominion at this work. Not the most celebrated. The Dominion celebrated tacticians and commanders, not analysts who sat in quiet rooms with sensor data and catalogs, but among those who understood what she did and what it was worth. Her name meant something. When a new threat emerged, when something showed up on the battlefield that didn't match the existing databases, they sent the data to Vrethsen. She had never taken more than 3 days on a classification. Never. The fastest she had ever worked was 6 hours. For a captured Corvette energy cannon, a weapon of considerable engineering sophistication that she had identified, categorized, and cross-referenced with 42 existing Dominion countermeasures before her morning meal had gone cold. She received the first human weapons shipment on a Tuesday. By Thursday, she had stopped eating meals at regular times. By the following Monday, she had stopped sleeping properly. By the end of the second week, she had produced 43 pages of notes and 0 completed classifications. 0. She stood in the middle of the analysis bay and looked at the objects spread across the examination tables and felt something she had not felt in 22 years of professional life. She felt lost. The bay was a large, white, carefully temperature-controlled room aboard the Dominion analysis vessel Measured Understanding. It was designed to hold captured weapons, run diagnostic scans, and produce clean data. Everything about the room was built for order. The lighting was even. The tables were measured distances apart. The scanning equipment was calibrated to within fractions of tolerance that had no name in most languages. The objects on the tables were not interested in any of this. Table 1 held what her initial scans had suggested might be a directed energy device. Closer examination revealed it was an agricultural tool specifically, something called a cattle prod that had been modified so extensively that perhaps 30% of its original components remained. The rest had been replaced with parts from at least 4 different sources: a vehicle's electrical system, a handheld communications device, something from a kitchen appliance she couldn't identify, and wire. A great deal of wire. It worked. When her technician had, against explicit instruction, pointed it at a scanning unit and activated it, the scanning unit had died in a way that took 2 days to repair. She had asked the technician what the power output was. He had shown her the numbers. She had looked at them for a while. "That's not possible," she said. "It happened," he said. She moved to Table 2. Table 2 held the vehicle. It was, As near as her team could determine, a large agricultural harvesting machine, the kind used to cut and collect grain crops across wide areas of farmland. It was, or had been, a civilian piece of equipment, with no weapons capability whatsoever. It weighed approximately 9,000 kilograms, and moved at a maximum speed of about 22 kilometers per hour. Someone had welded armor plates to the sides. The plates appeared to have come from the doors and body panels of several different ground vehicles, and they were attached with welds that were, she had to admit, solid. Not beautiful, not precise, but solid. On the top, someone had mounted a cannon. The cannon was made from water pipe, not the agricultural pipe from the first incident reports. This was different. Larger diameter, heavier gauge. The barrel was 2.5 meters long. The mounting was a bracket system that appeared to have been fabricated from scaffolding poles and truck parts, and then bolted through the roof of the harvesting machine in a way that structural engineers would have found upsetting. The cannon worked. She had the impact records. It had been used in 3 separate engagements in the coalition's southern sector. It had destroyed 2 Vreth forward command vehicles and damaged a 4th-rank fighter craft that had come in too low. A crop harvesting machine with a pipe cannon had damaged a 4th-rank fighter craft. She stood in front of it for a long time. "What is this?" she said quietly. It wasn't really a question. Tables 3 through 19 held variants. That was the word her team used. Variants. As if there were a standard version somewhere and these were different forms of it. In fact, there was no standard version. Every single object on every single table was the only one of its kind in existence. No 2 shared the same materials. No 2 shared the same construction method. No 2 worked the same way, exactly, though several worked in roughly similar directions. There were 17 versions of the fertilizer propellant launch system, each one different. Different pipe sizes, different fertilizer mixtures, different firing mechanisms. One of them had a digital targeting system that had clearly been removed from a piece of survey equipment. One of them had been fitted with a gyroscopic stabilizer from what her team identified as a children's toy. The children's toy stabilizer worked extremely well. She recorded this and then stared at what she had just written. Then there was the dishwasher. The dishwasher sat on table 14 and looked exactly like what it was. A household kitchen appliance for cleaning plates and cups. It was white. It had a door that opened from the front. It had, on the side that faced away from the wall, when it was installed in a kitchen, a series of ventilation slots. Through those ventilation slots, someone had inserted a launching mechanism. The dishwasher had been converted using its existing pressurized water pump, its existing heating element, its existing sealed chamber into a device that launched small incendiary rounds at targets within a 30-meter effective range. It had been used in an urban combat situation to clear a street of Vreth light infantry. She read the field report 3 times. Then she opened a new document on her analysis pad. She wrote at the top, "Working classification. Human Weapons Systems First Review." She sat there for a while. She deleted Weapons Systems and replaced it with Improvised Weapons Systems. She sat there for a while longer. She deleted the whole title and started again. Colonel James Ibarra had not slept for about the same amount of time as Vrethsen, but he was in a considerably better mood about it. He was called Brick by everyone who knew him, for reasons that had started as an insult 20 years ago in officer training school and had since become something else entirely. He was not a large man. He was not loud. He had a quiet face that looked like it was always in the middle of working something out, which it usually was. The Coalition's Southern Command had given him an unofficial title, the Fixer. When something needed to work and nobody had the parts for it to work, they called Brick. He had a reputation that made logistics officers nervous and supply clerks very, very tired. He was currently sitting in what used to be a farm equipment workshop, surrounded by 6 other people, who had also been brought in for the same general reason, looking at a Vreth sensor array that his team had recovered from a downed drone 2 days ago. The sensor array was intact, mostly. One of its housings was cracked, but the internals were functioning. "If we wire it backward," said Private Chidi Okafor, who was 19 and had spent 2 years before the war fixing electronics in his uncle's shop in Lagos. "What happens? It transmits to itself," Brick said, "loops its own signal. And if a Vreth targeting system picks that up, it'll try to track the loop. The loop goes nowhere. The targeting system spins." Chidi looked at the array. "Does that actually work?" Brick shrugged. Dropped it. Saw what it did when it broke. Figured I'd do that on purpose. The young officer to Bricks left Lieutenant HFY Darko, 26, fresh from the academy, still carrying the academy's habit of wanting things to be by the book, looked up from her notes. Sir, that's not a recognized electronic warfare technique. No. Brick agreed. The manual doesn't cover this. No. So how do we know it'll work? Brick picked up the cracked housing of the sensor array and turned it over in his hands. The manual was written for the weapons we have. We're working with what we have. Those are two different problems. He set the housing down and picked up a roll of wire. Chidi, show me the input port. Vrethsen called a meeting on the 14th day. Her team of 8 analysts sat around the table in the briefing room. They all had the same look, not exhausted exactly, more like a look people get when the ground they're standing on has been behaving in unexpected ways. And they've started to wonder if it's going to keep doing that. Let me explain the problem, she said. She pulled up the classification matrix on the display behind her. It was a large, color-coded system, the accumulated work of 300 years of Dominion weapons analysis. Every weapon ever cataloged sat somewhere in this matrix. Material composition, function type, manufacturing source, consistency rating. Every weapon we have ever encountered fits into this matrix, she said. Because every weapon ever made follows certain principles. It is manufactured in a standardized way. It uses consistent materials. It can be identified by its construction and function. Once we know what it is, we know how to counter it. She paused. Human weapons do not fit this matrix. She clicked to the next screen. It showed all 17 fertilizer mortar variants mapped against each other. From a distance, they looked like a family of related objects. Up close, every single one was completely different. Each of these was made by different people, in different places, with different available materials, in response to a specific situation that existed in that moment. None of them were made in a factory. None of them were made to a specification. None of them are the same as any of the others, or the same as anything else we have ever encountered. And she clicked to the next screen. The dishwasher. Someone in the room made a sound. Not quite a laugh. Not quite a groan. Something in between. This is a kitchen cleaning appliance, Vrethsen said. It was used as a weapon. It was effective. It has no designator in our system because there is no category for kitchen appliance repurposed as a launching platform, because we have never needed that category. No. She put down her datapad. Here is the problem. Our counter-doctrine system works by identifying what a weapon is, categorizing it, and deploying the appropriate response. To do this, we need to be able to predict what weapons the enemy will use. We predict this based on what weapons they have used before and what weapons their manufacturing capacity allows them to produce. She looked around the table. Humans do not have a manufacturing capacity for the weapons they are using. They are not producing these weapons. They are finding objects that are already present in their environment and converting those objects into weapons within hours. The fertilizer was there. The pipe was there. The dishwasher was there. They looked at things that were not weapons and made them into weapons. Silence in the room. We cannot predict what they will build next, she said. Because they cannot predict what they will build next. They build it in response to what is in front of them. To know what they'll do next, we would need to know every object present in every location where human soldiers might find themselves. On this planet, that is not possible. Her senior technician, Vreth Doss, who had been with her for 9 years and had never once questioned her conclusions, raised his hand. Can we develop a counter? She looked at him for a moment. A counter to what, specifically? The pipe? We destroy all pipes on the planet? The fertilizer? We destroy all agricultural chemicals? The dishwasher? She stopped. We cannot counter individual objects. The objects are not the weapon. She let that sit for a moment. The process is the weapon. The human ability to look at what is available and build something functional from it, that is what we are facing. And I do not know how to build a counter-doctrine for a cognitive process. The room was quiet. I am going to send my report to High Command, she said. I want it noted, for the record, that this is the first report I have submitted in 22 years that does not contain a complete classification or a recommended countermeasure. I want it further noted that this is not because of a failure of analysis. It is because the thing I am trying to analyze does not behave in a way that analysis was designed for. She picked up her datapad. We will continue working. Brick's backward-wired sensor array was tested 3 days later. A Vreth targeting drone came over the southern ridge at 0800 hours, tracking the heat signatures of coalition vehicles in the valley below. Standard Vreth procedure: precise, methodical. One target identified and handed off to the strike system. One target destroyed. Next target. Repeat. The drone identified the looping signal from Brick's modified array. The targeting system registered it as a valid contact. The system attempted to track it. The loop went back into itself. The system corrected. The loop corrected with it. The system adjusted. The loop adjusted. The drone spent 4 minutes trying to resolve a targeting solution that didn't exist, while 3 coalition vehicles drove away. Then the drone's targeting system tried to reset, hit the loop signal again during the reset cycle, and crashed completely. The drone descended in a slow, graceless spiral and sat down in a field. The pilot's emergency systems kicked in and extracted them safely. The drone was recovered intact. Lieutenant Darko, who had been watching from the ridge, came back to Brick's position. "It worked," she said. She sounded like she was still processing this. "Yes," Brick said. "The manual doesn't cover that." "I know." She looked at him for a moment. "Where do you get these ideas?" Brick was looking at the recovered drone. He was already looking at it the way he looked at everything, the quiet, working something out look. The look that made logistics officers nervous. "The Vreth have perfect weapons for situations they've been in before," he said, not looking away from the drone. "We're building for the situation we're in right now. Once you understand that, everything around you starts to look different." He picked up a piece of the drone's outer casing, turned it over. "Everything starts to look useful." Vreth Sen's report was 39 pages. The last page contained 1 paragraph, and that paragraph contained 1 sentence that her supervisor read, then reread, then forwarded to High Command, without additional comment. It said, "We cannot develop a counter-doctrine for this threat, because counter-doctrine requires the ability to predict the enemy's methods, and the enemy's methods are determined in real time by whatever materials are present in their immediate environment, which means that to predict their weapons we would need to know the location and type of every manufactured object on a planet of 8 billion people, which is not feasible, and therefore the honest conclusion of this analysis is that we do not currently have an answer to this problem, and I am not certain such an answer exists." High Command read it. There was a long meeting. Vreth Call's occupation schedule, which had already been pushed back twice, was pushed back again. Nobody wanted to give it a new date. In the workshop, in the evenings, Brick's team kept building things. They had the drone now. They had the sensor array, and the targeting systems, and the power cells, and the flight stabilizers. They had the tools from the workshop walls, and the materials from the shelves, and the ideas that came from looking at available things and asking, "What does this want to be now?" Chidi had an idea about the flight stabilizers that he worked on for 6 hours straight without eating. At 2 in the morning he showed Brick what he had. Brick looked at it for a long moment. "That is genuinely wrong," he said. Chidi nodded eagerly. "I know. In a good way?" "I think so." Brick picked it up, turned it over, tested the weight of it in his hand. "What does it do?" Chidi told him. Brick looked at the object. He looked at the workshop. He looked at the shelves. "How many can we build?" he said. "With what we have here? Maybe 12. "Build 12, Brick said. "Then we'll tell the others how." Vreth Sen stood in the analysis bay one last time before the shipment was sent to the archive. Everything went back into the containers. The fertilizer mortars with their 17 different shapes. The cattle prod that wasn't a cattle prod. The harvesting machine with the pipe cannon. The dishwasher. She stood in front of the dishwasher for a while. It was, objectively, a terrible weapon. Short range. Slow reload. Limited ammunition. Completely absurd. It had cleared a street of Vreth light infantry. She thought about the mind that had looked at a dishwasher and thought, "I can work with this." Whatever combination of desperation and creativity and sheer stubbornness had looked at a kitchen appliance and decided it was a solution. She could not model that process. She could not put it in her matrix. She could not find its lower limit. Because it seemed like it didn't have one, it would go as low as it needed to go. Use whatever was available. Find a function in a thing that had no business having that function. She almost reached out and touched it. She didn't. That would have been unprofessional. She turned and left the bay. In the doorway she paused, just for a moment, and did not look back. In her report she had called it a threat. Standing in the doorway she wondered if that was the right word. Then she kept walking, because she had 43 pages of notes to turn into a final document, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that 43 pages was not going to be enough. She was right. It took 60, and she still wasn't sure she'd answered the question. The gymnasium smelled like old rubber and floor polish. It was a big building, the kind built in the 2040s when cities were still expanding fast, and the thinking was that bigger was always better. The basketball courts ran the full length of the main floor. The overhead lights were industrial, hanging from the ceiling on chains, throwing flat white light over everything. It had been a school gymnasium 3 weeks ago. Now it was the most important building in what was left of human military infrastructure. And Director Amara Ose-Bonsu was standing in the middle of it with a cold cup of coffee, looking at 7 people she had personally chosen to possibly save what remained of the coalition's ability to fight back. She looked at them for a long time. A plumber named George who had 30 years of experience forcing water to go where water did not want to go, and who had called the entire engineering establishment. A bunch of people who are afraid of pipes. In a widely read interview 3 years ago, 2 game developers, sisters, Ya and Efua Boateng, who had spent the last decade building game physics engines and who understood, better than most people alive, exactly how to make fictional objects do things that real objects were not supposed to be able to do. A demolitions engineer named Serwa who had been fired from 3 different firms in 5 years. The first firm said she was too aggressive in her solutions. The second firm said her solutions were structurally creative but commercially unacceptable. The third firm, in the termination letter that had made it into the engineering community gossip channels, had simply written, "Serwa solves problems in ways that make the problems afraid of her. We cannot afford the liability." A competitive barbecue champion named Kweku who had, at regional level, built a smoker out of a car engine block, a refrigerator compressor, and a satellite dish, and had won first prize 3 years running. And finally, in the chair at the end of the table, a retired NASA field engineer named Dr. Patience Asare, who was 71 years old and who had once kept a Mars rover alive for 6 additional years, using software patches she wrote during a 2-week period of insomnia in a hotel room in Pasadena. She had written them in a programming language that the rover technically wasn't designed to use. The rover hadn't cared. These were not soldiers. Not one of them had ever planned a weapon system or held a formal military role. Amara had chosen every single one of them on purpose. She had read the field reports herself. All of them. Sergeant Ose's fertilizer mortar. Colonel Ibarra's backward-wired sensor array. The 17 variants of the pipe launcher. The dishwasher she had reread that one 3 times. She had read Vrethsen's analysis too, which had been intercepted, translated, and passed up the chain until it landed on her desk with a note that said, "The enemy has told us what we are. We should listen." The note was from the coalition's chief of defense, which told her something about how serious things had become. The enemy's own analyst had written, "We cannot predict their methods." Amara had sat with that for a full day. Then she had picked up the phone and started making calls. She put a single piece of paper on the table in front of each of them. The paper had 3 lines on it. The first line said, "We are losing the conventional war." The second line said, "We are not losing the improvised one." The third line said, "We are going to make the improvised one official." George the plumber read it, looked up. "Official how?" "Funded," Amara said. "Staffed. Deliberately designed. And then handed to every coalition unit in the field as a framework they can use." Serwa, the demolitions engineer, picked up her paper. "You want to standardize improvisation. I want to give people permission," Amara said, "and tools, and the thinking behind why it works. Right now soldiers are doing this because they run out of options and they're desperate. I want them doing it before they run out of options. I want them doing it as a first choice." Ya Boateng, the older of the 2 sisters, folded her piece of paper into a small square. It was the kind of thing people did when they were thinking hard. "In our engine work, we have a term for this. Emergent solutions. The physics system doesn't know it's going to make something interesting until you push it hard enough, and then something happens that you didn't design for." "That," Amara said. "Yes. Exactly that. Dr. Asare, at the end of the table, had not touched her paper. She was looking at the ceiling, the big gymnasium ceiling with its chains and its flat lights. When the rover's main navigation system went down, she said, not to anyone in particular, the textbook answer was to wait for the next orbital window and attempt a remote patch. That would have taken 11 days. I did not have 11 days. I had the rover's secondary sensory array, a programming language from 2019 that nobody used anymore, and a very bad hotel room. So I used those things. She lowered her gaze to the table. What's the rover's name now? Persistence, Amara said. Asari nodded slowly. Because it kept going. Because it kept going. Silence in the gymnasium. Then Kweku, the barbecue champion, leaned back in his chair and said, What's our budget? Unlimited, Amara said. He nodded, the way people nod when they hear something they've been waiting their whole career to hear. When do we start? You started, Amara said. When you walked in. Grand Tactician Vrethon had not attended a tactical briefing in person for 6 years. He commanded the Dominion's largest forward fleet from a chamber that was designed, deliberately, to separate him from the noise of moment-to-moment decisions. His staff handled the immediate situation. He handled the shape of the campaign, the months-long arc of it, the pieces that most commanders couldn't see because they were too close to the ground. He was very good at this. It was why he was Grand Tactician. In 22 campaigns over 40 years, he had never looked at a battlefield and not understood it. He looked at the current map. He looked at it for a long time. The map showed 6 weeks of engagement data. Red markers for Vreth forces their positions, movements, supply lines, losses. Blue markers for human coalition forces the same data, filtered through intelligence reports and sensor sweeps. The red markers were doing what red markers were supposed to do in a campaign of this type, advancing, consolidating. The supply lines were largely restored after the relay incident. The orbital assets were functioning. By every standard metric of Dominion military doctrine, the campaign was proceeding within acceptable parameters. The blue markers were wrong. Not wrong in the sense of incorrect data. Wrong in the sense that they were doing things that blue markers were not supposed to do at this stage of a campaign. They should have been retreating to defensible positions, consolidating their remaining forces, running out of options. Instead, they were attacking from directions that didn't make tactical sense. They were hitting supply lines at points that no military doctrine would identify as vulnerable, because those points were only vulnerable to weapons that shouldn't exist. They were moving through terrain that their vehicles weren't rated for, and the reason, his intelligence report said, was that their vehicles had been modified, in the field, with available materials. Every time his forces advanced and consolidated a position, something happened at the perimeter that the position wasn't designed to handle. Not because humans had better weapons, because they kept making new ones. The dishwasher incident was in the reports. He read it. Then he read it again. He pulled up Vrethsen's analysis from the week before and read her final sentence again. We cannot develop a counter-doctrine for this threat. He had read that sentence when it first arrived and had felt it was the kind of thing an analyst said when they were being overly dramatic. He read it again now, looking at his map, and felt that it was the kind of thing a person said when they were telling the truth and didn't want to. He told his aide to clear the next 2 hours. He sat with the map. The gymnasium, by the end of week 1, had changed. The basketball courts were covered in materials. Not weapons materials, not yet. Ordinary things. George had requisitioned a delivery of plumbing pipe in 17 different gauges. Serwa had a table covered in agricultural chemicals, compounds, and household materials that she was testing combinations of with the clinical focus of someone who had never once been afraid of what might happen when you mixed things together. The Boateng sisters had set up screens on one wall and were running simulations not of finished weapons, but of materials under stress. How this breaks, what this does when you heat it, how far that flies. Dr. Asare had a single table with a single object on it, a standard-issue coalition field radio, circa 2019, that had been damaged by a Vreth electromagnetic pulse. Dead. Useless. She was taking it apart. She had been taking it apart since Monday. On Thursday evening, Amara found her still at the table, a circuit board held up to the light, squinting. What are you doing with that? Amara said. Understanding it, Asari said. It doesn't work. Not the way it was built to work, Asari said. She turned the board over. But nothing is only the thing it was built to be. It is also its materials, its components, the principles it runs on. She set the board down. When you take a thing apart and understand why it is the way it is, you start seeing what else it could be. Amara looked at the spread of components on the table. Small pieces of a dead radio. Nothing that looked like anything. Is there a weapon in there? She said. Asari gave her a look that was not quite a smile. Director, there is a weapon in everything. That is the whole point. At the end of week 2, they had a framework. They called it the CROW. Continuously repurposed offensive wreckage. The name was Kweku's idea. He had been insisting that you needed a good acronym for something to spread. And the Boateng sisters had spent 40 minutes workshopping options before landing on Crow, which Ya said had the right feeling. Crows take whatever they find and use it, she said. That's exactly right. The CROW was not a weapon. It was a process. A documented, teachable, replicable process for turning whatever existed in a given environment into a functional offensive system within 4 hours. It had 4 stages. The first stage was assessment, a structured way of looking at a space and identifying everything present in terms of material properties, not intended purpose. Not, that is a fence. That is 2-gauge galvanized steel. Not, that is a car. That is a steel frame, glass panels, rubber tires, a fuel system, and 300 individual mechanical components. The second stage was function mapping, cross-referencing available materials against a list of desired weapons functions. You needed a projectile. You needed propellant. You needed a delivery mechanism. You needed something to aim with. Which available materials could fill each role? The third stage was build, the actual construction, with a set of principles derived from George and Serwa's combined knowledge about what holds together under stress and what doesn't. The fourth stage was test, adjust, deploy. The whole thing fit in a 12-page document. Amara read it 3 times. Then she read it once more. Then she went home and fed her cat and sat at her kitchen table for an hour without turning on any lights. Her niece called that night. Dara's voice on the phone was rough in the way that it got when she hadn't been sleeping enough, which was always now. She was somewhere south. She didn't say exactly where, for reasons both of them understood. I heard there's something coming down from command, Dara said. Something is coming, Amara said. Good kind of something? Amara thought about the gymnasium, the plumber and the demolitions engineer and the sisters and the barbecue champion. Doctor, Asari taking apart a dead radio in the dark because she wanted to understand what else it could be. It's our kind of something, she said. Dara was quiet for a moment. The pipe thing worked again, by the way. We built a new one. Better. Enyo changed the mixture. I know. I read the report. Another pause. Did you know it was going to work? Amara thought about that. I knew that you would try, she said. I knew that you wouldn't stop. That's the same thing. With enough time, Vrethon called his senior staff into the command chamber on a Tuesday. They stood around the strategic display and looked at the map. He let them look for a few minutes without saying anything. Let them see what he'd been seeing. Then his second-in-command, Vrethalis, sharp, careful, the best instinctive strategist on the ship, pointed to the cluster of blue markers on the southern sector. They're building something, she said. The materials acquisition patterns in the intelligence reports, they're pulling things from too many different locations for these to be individual unit actions. Someone is coordinating this. And, quote, yes, Vrethon said. What are they building? Vrethon looked at the map. The honest answer was, he didn't know. He had never, in 40 years, not known what an enemy was building. He had the materials data. He had the intelligence reports. He had 40 years of pattern recognition and the deepest strategic database the Dominion had ever compiled. It told him nothing useful, because the materials were too varied, too unpredictable. Fertilizer and pipe and electronics and vehicle parts and kitchen appliances and things he couldn't identify. It was not a weapon program. It was every object in an 8 billion-person civilization being evaluated for how it might be used to kill him. Something new, he said. He said it quietly. The room was silent. Should we request a ceasefire? Vrethalis said, not as a strategic recommendation, as a question. She was asking him, genuinely, what he thought. He did not answer immediately. On his map, the blue markers moved in directions that didn't make sense, building something he couldn't predict, with materials that shouldn't work toward purposes he couldn't model. Not yet, he said. I want to understand what we're dealing with first. He looked at the map for another long moment. But draft the communication, he said. Have it ready. Vrethalis nodded and left. Vrethon stood alone in the chamber and looked at his map for a long time after that. The Crow framework was printed, packaged, and distributed to every coalition unit in the field over a 5-day period. The distribution included the document, a set of illustrated guides for common construction scenarios, and a short message from Amara's office that said, essentially, you've been doing this anyway. Now here is the language for it, and permission, and the knowledge that you are not alone in doing it. The response from the field came back within 48 hours. Units sent reports of what they'd built. Some of it was small modifications to existing weapons that improved function or extended range. Some of it was large. Sergeant Osei's unit in the northeast sent a description of a vehicle they had put together over 3 days, using the frame of a broken-down transport, the power cell from a Vreth drone they'd recovered, and a targeting system built from agricultural survey equipment. They had tested it. It worked. Amara read every report. She was in the gymnasium when the volume of reports started to come in too fast to read individually. Her aide started summarizing them and she read the summaries, and those started coming too fast too. She stood in the middle of the gymnasium floor and watched the data pile up and understood that she had not built a weapons program. She had built a permission structure for something that had already been happening, something that was already in the nature of the people fighting this war, already in the nature of her niece in a basement with a pipe and a list. She had given it a name and a framework and said, yes, this, do more of this. And the thing had responded the way things respond when you finally tell them they're allowed to be what they already are. She thought about what Dr. Asari had said. There is a weapon in everything. She looked around the gymnasium, the rubber floor, and the chains and the flat lights. She thought about how, 3 weeks ago, this had been a place where children played basketball. She thought about what it was now. Then she went and poured herself a new cup of coffee, because the old one had been cold for hours, and there was still a great deal of work to do. Vrethon's communication to the coalition government was sent 4 days later. It was a ceasefire request. In 4,000 years of Dominion military history, the Grand Tactician had never sent one. His aide confirmed 3 times that he wanted to send it. He said yes, each time. After the third confirmation, when the message had been transmitted and the aide had gone, Vrethon stood alone in the command chamber and thought about a specific data point from the intelligence report. The volume of coalition materials acquisition in the last 72 hours had tripled. They were building faster now. Whatever coordination had begun, it was accelerating. He thought about Vrethsen's sentence. The more desperate their situation, the more dangerous they become. He looked at the map. The blue markers moving in their wrong directions, building their impossible things. His forces were still advancing, still winning by the numbers. He had requested the ceasefire anyway. He was Grand Tactician for a reason. The reason was that he understood, before the numbers told him, when the numbers were lying. The neutral station sat between 2 systems like a coin balanced on its edge. It had been built 80 years ago for exactly this purpose, a place with no affiliation, no strategic value, nothing worth fighting over, just rooms and corridors and a docking bay, turning slowly in the nothing between stars. It had been used for exactly 2 prior negotiations in its entire existence. It smelled, for reasons no one had ever fully explained, faintly, of something like old library books. Ambassador Kofi Mensah arrived at 0900 hours, station time. He was eating a meat pie. He had gotten it from the small commissary near the docking bay. The station staff had stocked it with food from both delegations' worlds. A standard diplomatic courtesy gesture. The human section had 3 options. Mensah had chosen the meat pie because it was closest to the door, and he was hungry, and the flight from the transit point had taken longer than expected. He was a middle-height man in his late 50s, with a calm face and a slightly rumpled jacket, and a way of standing in rooms that made him look like he'd been there for an hour already. 3 different intelligence services had files on him. The files all contained the phrase distressingly relaxed. One of them contained the additional note, Subject does not appear to understand the weight of his own assignments. This was incorrect. Mensa understood the weight perfectly. He simply didn't wear it on his face, because he had found, over 30 years of diplomatic work, that the person who looked least afraid at a table usually had the most leverage. On his right wrist, looped around it like a very utilitarian bracelet, was a roll of duct tape. His aide noticed it when they were walking down the corridor toward the negotiation room. "Ambassador," the aide said, keeping his voice low and neutral. "The duct tape." Mensa looked at his wrist. Yes. He had grabbed it off his desk at the transit point while looking for his data pad. He had been intending to leave it on the table, but then the transport had come early, and he'd walked out with it, still on his wrist. Should I take it? Mensa thought about this for half a second. No, leave it. The Vreth delegation will notice it. I know, Mensa said, and took another bite of his meat pie. Vrethon watched the arrival footage from the observation room. He watched Mensa walk off the transport. He watched the meat pie. He watched the aide say something and Mensa look at his wrist. He watched Mensa decide to keep the duct tape. He watched this footage for 4 minutes. Then he called his tactical analyst, Vrethron, into the room. Tell me about duct tape, he said. Vrethron blinked. The adhesive material? Yes. Vrethron thought for a moment. It is a general-purpose bonding and sealing material used in human construction, repair, and manufacturing. It has very broad application across industries. It is considered a basic utility material not specialized in any particular field. Why is he wearing it on his wrist? I believe he forgot it was there. Vrethon looked at the frozen footage, Mensa's expression as he'd looked at his wrist, the brief pause. The decision. He could have taken it off, Vrethon said. Yes. He chose not to. It appears so. Vrethon stood there for a moment. Is this a tactic? Vrethron considered. I don't believe so, sir. Our behavioral analysis of Ambassador Mensa suggests that he is genuinely relaxed about this. About most things, apparently. Vrethon looked at the footage for another moment. A man who had just arrived to negotiate a ceasefire at the end of the most disorienting military campaign the Dominion had experienced in its history, wearing a roll of adhesive tape on his wrist because he'd forgotten it there and couldn't be bothered to take it off. He felt that this was either completely irrelevant or extremely significant, and he could not determine which. He went to the negotiation room. The table was long and gray and neutral, as all tables in this station were. There were chairs on both sides, water and other liquids in the center. The station lights were set to a frequency that was supposed to be comfortable for both human and Vreth eyes, which meant it was mildly uncomfortable for both, which the station designers had apparently felt was fair. Mensa was already seated when Vrethon arrived. He had finished the meat pie. His aide was sitting 2 chairs down, datapad open. The duct tape was on the table in front of Mensa, where he had apparently set it while taking off his jacket. Vrethon sat down with his 2 staff members. He placed his own data materials on the table. There was a standard opening protocol for negotiation proceedings. Both parties stated their names, their authority to negotiate, and their general position. His staff had prepared a full opening statement, the Dominion's terms, clearly laid out, the territorial boundaries they were proposing, the timeline they were working from. He opened his mouth to begin. Would anyone like tea? Mensa said. Vrethon stopped. Mensa was looking at him with a genuinely friendly expression, the expression of someone who has just arrived at someone else's house and is trying to be a good guest. He had apparently located, at some point before Vrethon arrived, the station's beverage service, and he had a teapot on the table that definitely hadn't been there in the pre-meeting setup. The station commissary had a decent selection, Mensa said. I took the liberty. Vrethon's staff looked at him. He looked at the teapot. He looked at Mensa. He said, Yes, thank you. It was the first time in 40 years of military command that Vrethon had started a formal negotiation session with tea. They talked about tea for almost an hour, not because either of them had planned this. It happened the way conversations happen when one person asks a question with genuine curiosity and the other person has an actual answer. Mensa had questions about Vreth beverage culture. Vrethon had questions about human tea specifically. There were hundreds of varieties, which Mensa apparently knew something about, and the conversation moved between types and origins and preparation methods in a way that Vrethon's staff found baffling. and Mensa's aide was recording carefully because he'd seen this before. This was how Mensa worked. Not a tactic, exactly. More like a baseline. He was interested in people. He was interested in things. He was interested in whatever was in front of him, and that interest was genuine, and people responded to genuine interest in ways they did not respond to formal procedure. By the time they got to the actual negotiation, Vrethon had told Mensa something about his home city, a detail about the way markets were laid out there that he had not intended to share. Not because it was sensitive, simply because it had come up naturally, and he had answered naturally, and he was still slightly confused about how that had happened. The formal negotiation took about 3 hours. The Dominion's position was clear. A territorial boundary that preserved their existing occupied zones. A prisoner exchange. A halt to all coalition offensive action. And this was the point that Vrethon's staff had flagged as the central requirement, a formal agreement that the coalition would cease the development and deployment of what the Dominion was now officially calling non-standard adaptive weapon systems. Mensa listened to all of this. He drank his tea. He took no notes, his aide took notes, and he nodded at intervals in the way that people nod when they are genuinely hearing and processing what they're being told, not just waiting for their turn to speak. When Vrethon's staff finished presenting the terms, Mensa set down his cup. Territory? Yes, he said. We can agree to a boundary. The existing occupied zones, we'd want minor adjustments in 3 sectors. I'll send the specifics. Prisoner exchange? Absolutely, yes, that's straightforward. Halt to coalition offensive action? Yes, with a mutually agreed timeline. He paused. The last one we can't do. Vrethon's aide leaned forward. You cannot agree to halt weapons development? The weapons development isn't a program, Mensa said. That's the thing. You're asking us to stop something that isn't centralized. It's not coming from a weapons laboratory or a manufacturing facility. Your own analyst's report called it a cognitive process. You can't ask us to stop a cognitive process in exchange for a ceasefire, because we cannot switch it off. It's not a switch we have. Vrethon looked at him. You're telling me your military will simply continue improvising weapons regardless of any agreement you sign. I'm telling you our people will continue solving problems with available materials, Mensa said. They've been doing that for as long as we've been human. The war gave them a reason to do it in a military direction. If the war ends, most of them will go back to fixing their cars with it. Mensa picked up the roll of duct tape from in front of him and turned it over in his hands. Not a gesture for effect. He just seemed to do this, pick things up when he was thinking. You're asking us to stop breathing, he said. We'd agree, and then just do it anyway and feel bad about it afterward. That's not a useful ceasefire. Silence in the room. Vrethon looked at the duct tape in Mensa's hands. The gray-silver roll of it, turning slowly. Is this, he said, and nodded at the tape, a weapon? Mensa looked at it. Genuine consideration. It could be, he said, in the right situation. Honestly, the most dangerous thing I've ever been in a room with was a box of kitchen matches and a very bored engineer, and she made them perfectly safe eventually. But the first 20 minutes were interesting. Something happened in Vrethon's face. Not quite an expression, more like the absence of one. A very careful stillness that his staff would have recognized as the face he made when he was updating a model. You are not afraid of what your own people will build, he said. Not a question. Mensa put the tape down. Of course we are, he said. We're afraid of everything. We've always been afraid. That's been true since the beginning of the species. We're afraid of you. We were afraid from the first day those ships showed up. He met Vrethon's eyes across the table. But being afraid doesn't make us stop. It makes us build faster. Vrethon looked at him for a long moment. That, he said slowly, is not how fear is supposed to work. No, Mensa said agreeably. We've heard that before. They took a break at midday. Vrethon walked to the observation window at the end of the corridor and stood there, looking at the space between stars. His aide came and stood nearby and said nothing, which was what Vrethon wanted. He was thinking about a campaign from 15 years ago. The core expansion. He had been a sector commander then, not grand tactician, and the campaign had been difficult. The core were a smart species, well armed, and they had fought hard, but he had always understood them. He had always understood what they would do next, because they were afraid, and fear made them contract, made them defensive, made them easier to predict, fear into retreat. That was the logic. That was how it had always worked with every species in the Dominion's history. Fear into invention. That was a different thing. That was a thing he did not have a language for, and could not put in his doctrine, and could not counter, because you could not build a wall against something that built its tools from the wall. He thought about the fertilizer mortar. He had read that report many times. A unit, cut off from supply, faced with annihilation, had looked at what was around them, things that were not weapons, had never been weapons, would never be weapons in any reasonable universe, and had made weapons. Because they were afraid. Because being afraid was, apparently, for these people, the beginning of the process, rather than the end of it. He stood there for a while. Then he went back to the table. The final agreement took another 2 hours. Territory, prisoner exchange, cessation of active offensive operations, not a permanent end, but a pause, a breathing space. The weapons clause was removed. Vrethon's staff had wanted to push harder on it, but he had made the decision, and he did not revisit decisions once he had made them, and he had looked across the table at a man eating a meat pie with a roll of adhesive tape on his wrist, and understood that this was not a battle he could win in a negotiation room. He could not ask people to stop being what they were. When the final document was ready, Mensa signed first. Then, Vrethon. Then Mensa stood up and put out his hand. Vrethon stood and looked at it for a moment. Human hand. 5 fingers. 1 opposable. He had 4 fingers, 2 partially opposable. The handshake as a gesture was human in origin. The Dominion had its own greeting formalities, none of which involved touching. He took the hand anyway. They shook, both of them adjusting. Mensa's grip slightly too firm for Vreth grip structure. Vrethon's fingers landing in the wrong places on Mensa's hand. Neither of them pulled back. They held the shake for a moment, both of them doing the small, constant adjustments of 2 different things that have decided to make contact work. Then they let go. Mensa smiled. Then he collected his jacket and his data pad and spoke briefly with his aide. He left the duct tape on the table. Vrethon stood in the room after the human delegation had gone. His staff gathered their materials. His aide asked if he wanted the post-negotiation briefing immediately or after a rest period. He said after. The aide nodded and left. He stood in the empty room. The table was gray and neutral and cleared of materials. The water containers, the 2 teacups, still there from the morning, one on each side of the table. The station lights at their compromised frequency that was uncomfortable for everyone. And in the middle of the table, the roll of duct tape. He looked at it for a long time. He thought about what Mensa had said. You're asking us to stop breathing. He thought about Vrethsen's report. The weapon is the cognitive process. He thought about the fertilizer, mortar, and the dishwasher, and the backward-wired sensor array, and the 17 variations, and the Crow framework, and whatever the coalition was building right now in its improvised workshops with its plumbers and its demolitions engineers and its people who looked at broken things and couldn't stop touching them. He picked up the duct tape. He turned it over in his hands the way Mensa had turned it over. It was not beautiful. It was gray and slightly sticky at the edges, and entirely ordinary. He pressed his thumb against the surface. It gripped, pulled back, gripped again. It would bond almost any surface to almost any other surface. It was not strong. A real adhesive would hold better. It was not precise. You could not do fine work with it. It was not designed for any one thing. It was designed for all things, approximately, imperfectly, well enough. He understood why Mensa had kept it, not as a message, not as a symbol. Just because it was the right kind of object to have in your hand when you were going somewhere uncertain and you didn't know what you'd need. He tucked it under his arm. He walked to the docking bay. On the ship, later, his aide found him at his strategy desk with the tape in front of him, looking at the map. Sir, the aide said carefully. What is that for? Vrethon looked at the tape. He looked at the map. He looked at the blue markers, moving in their strange directions, building their unknowable things. I have no idea, he said. He left it on the desk. He worked around it. It was still there 3 weeks later, when the ceasefire held for the first time without incident. And he sat down at the desk and looked at it again, and still could not have said exactly why he kept it, except that it seemed, somehow, like the right kind of thing to have nearby, the kind of thing that might be useful, eventually, in the right situation. The child's name was Adais. She was 8 years old. She lived in a house with a yellow door on the edge of a small city, in the Western Coalition, and she had been outside in the yard since after breakfast, which was 2 hours ago. Her mother had checked on her once. Adaez had been on her knees in the dirt with her tongue slightly out, which was what she did when she was concentrating, surrounded by the parts of what used to be a bicycle that had belonged to her older brother, before he decided he was too old for it and left it in the yard. The bicycle was in pieces now. Not broken pieces, not accident pieces, deliberate pieces. Adaeze had taken it apart the same methodical way she took apart everything, the same way she had taken apart the old radio, and the kitchen clock that stopped working, and the toy car with the wheel that stuck, all of which she had also taken apart and put back together in ways that were, depending on your point of view, interesting or alarming. Her mother had looked at the bicycle pieces, looked at Adaeze's expression, and decided not to ask questions. She brought a glass of water out at 11 o'clock. "What are you building?" she said. Adaeze looked up. She had a smear of grease on her left cheek from the bicycle chain, and the expression on her face was the focused, inward one, the expression that meant she was mostly elsewhere, in the problem, in the thing she was trying to work out. "I don't know yet," Adaeze said. She drank the water and went back to the pieces. Vreth Sen retired from the Dominion Analysis Corps on a Thursday. She had been in the Corps for 31 years. Her career had produced over 2,000 classified reports. She had been given 3 separate commendations for excellence in the field, one of them signed by the Grand Strategist himself, and a small, quiet office in the analysis campus on the Dominion's home world that she had occupied for 11 years and that she would miss, she realized, as she cleared her desk, more than she had expected to. The office had a window. The window looked out over the campus gardens, a controlled, precise arrangement of plants from 7 different worlds, maintained at exact specifications of light and moisture and temperature, everything exactly where it was supposed to be, everything exactly the color it was supposed to be. She was going to miss that window. She packed the last of her things into a single container. Her career fit into one container. She had never been a person who accumulated objects. The work was the thing. The work lived in her reports and her databases and her classifications, and those would stay when she left. All of them except one. She picked up the printed copy of her final report, the one she had written 3 years after the ceasefire, the one that had been classified for 2 years and then leaked, then translated, then quietly read by every intelligence and military establishment in the known galaxy. The copy had her own notes in the margins, small observations, corrections, things she'd thought of after the fact. The printed pages were worn at the corners from being picked up and read. She put it in the container. She picked up the container. She left. The report was 60 pages. The first 59 covered what had happened: the weapons, the variants, the classification failures, the analysis of the Crow framework, the intelligence on the distributed nature of the coalition's improvised warfare. Careful, thorough, documented. The product of 3 years of continuing analysis after the ceasefire, incorporating everything that had been learned during and after the active conflict. It was good work. Her best work. She thought better than anything she had produced in the prior 31 years, because it was the first time she had been genuinely uncertain and had written from that uncertainty rather than from the confidence of someone who knew the answer before she started. The last page was different. The last page was not analysis. It was she had argued with herself about this, had rewritten it 6 times, had almost cut it more like a conclusion of a different kind. Not a summary of data, a statement of what the data meant, what it pointed toward, what you had to believe, if you believed the data. She had written the last page in one sitting, in the middle of the night, and had not changed it after that. In 4,000 years of recorded Dominion history, we have encountered 43 spacefaring civilizations. Of these, 11 were capable of significant armed resistance at the time of first contact. All 11 were ultimately managed through the application of superior technology and doctrine. In every prior case, the pattern was the same. The opposing civilization possessed fixed military capabilities that could be assessed, classified, and countered. Their weapons were known quantities. Their tactics were learnable. Their fear, when it came, produced withdrawal, smaller operations, defensive postures, the gradual contraction of a species under pressure. Humanity does not follow this pattern. This is not because they are more advanced than the species we have previously encountered. In technological terms, at the time of first contact, they were not. Their conventional military capabilities were significant but within manageable parameters. Their weapons were classifiable. Their doctrine was learnable. The problem is that their conventional military capabilities are not the point. The point is what happens when those capabilities are removed. When a Vreth unit loses its designated weapons, it requests resupply. It defends its current position. It waits. When a human unit loses its designated weapons, it looks around. This is not a trained behavior. We have extensive documentation of the first incidents: the fertilizer mortar, the modified harvesting vehicle, the kitchen appliance, the backward-wired sensor array. None of these were the product of military training. None were the product of a weapons program. They were the product of individual human beings, in desperate situations, looking at what was available, and applying to it a question that humans appear to apply to everything, automatically, without being told to. What can this do that it was not designed to do? This question is not a tactic. It is a reflex. It appears to be as fundamental to human cognition as breathing, and like breathing, it cannot be switched off by agreement or decree. The Crow framework, the coalition's attempt to formalize this reflex as doctrine, did not create the behavior. It named it. Today so. It gave soldiers permission to do deliberately what they were already doing instinctively. The rate of improvised weapons incidents did not begin with the Crow framework. It began on day 4 of the invasion, when a human supply driver accidentally destroyed a communications relay, because the relay's navigation lights were the same color as the road. Before the convoy reached its destination, soldiers at the site had already begun assessing the materials available to them in the surrounding area. The accident came first. The response was immediate. We did not understand this in time. I do not believe we could have understood it in time, because it required us to imagine a form of military behavior that our doctrine had no category for, a species that becomes more operationally dangerous as its situation worsens. The correct tactical response to this is not available within our existing framework, because our existing framework is built on the assumption that sufficient pressure produces either surrender or stalemate. Sufficient pressure on a human force produces invention. We have no counter-doctrine for invention. My recommendation, which I make with full acknowledgement that it is neither comfortable nor actionable, is as follows. Do not go to war with humanity, not because they are stronger. At the point of first contact, by most measures, they were not. Not because they are braver. Courage is not rare in the galaxy, and we have encountered it before without consequence. Do not go to war with them because they are afraid, and because their fear does not produce retreat, and because there is no lower limit to what they will use. They will use the pipe. They will use the fertilizer. They will use the kitchen appliance. They will use the broken radio and the children's toy, and the parts of the vehicle they were just riding in. They will look at the thing you built to destroy them and find a use for it before it finishes destroying them. And they will do all of this not because they are trained for it, but because they cannot stop. We have no name for this. We should. The report was leaked 18 months after its initial classification. The translation into 14 galactic standard languages took 6 weeks. The informal distribution through intelligence networks took about 3 more months. After that, it moved on its own, the way things move when they tell people something they already half suspected and needed someone to say clearly. Every major spacefaring civilization in the known galaxy read it. Some of them read it twice. 2 of them species who had been in quiet preliminary discussions about their own potential expansion into human-occupied space read it, closed the file, and did not reopen it. They put the expansion plans in a drawer. The drawer stayed closed. The Corps, who had fought the Dominion to a standstill 15 years before and had been watching the human conflict with professional interest, sent a representative to the coalition 6 months after the ceasefire. The representative was not there to negotiate. She was there, she said, to talk. She had questions about the Crow framework. She had questions about the fertilizer ratios. She had, at the end of a very long dinner that went on well past the scheduled end time, one final question. Is this a thing you teach? She said. Or is it a thing you are? 1. Ambassador Mensah, who had been at the dinner because he was still the coalition's preferred face in rooms that needed someone who looked calm, thought about it for a moment. Yes, he said. The Corps representative looked at him. Both, he said, at the same time. What? She thought about this for a while. Then she nodded, slowly, the way someone nods when an answer is more complicated than they expected and is also, somehow, exactly right. Dara Osei left the military 14 months after the ceasefire. She didn't make a ceremony of it. She filed the paperwork, collected her kit, shook hands with the people she needed to shake hands with, and got on a transport home. She sat by the window for the whole flight and watched the landscape change below the green coming back where the strikes had burned it. The buildings being put back up, the roads being relaid. She got home. She slept for 2 days. Her mother cooked for 3. On the 4th day, she went out to the workshop behind the house, the one her father had used for car repair before he passed, full of tools on the walls and parts on shelves, and the specific smell of metal and oil that she had grown up breathing. And she sat on the workbench and looked around at everything. The tools, the shelves, the parts with no obvious immediate purpose. She had sat in a room like this before, a maintenance room off the main floor of a grain facility, with water in her boots, and 14 people behind her, and a very bad situation getting worse. She had looked at the shelves then and asked, what else is in the building? She looked at the shelves now. The feeling was the same. Not anxiety, something that had anxiety inside it but was bigger. The turning on of a particular kind of attention, the question forming, the look at what was available. She picked up a length of pipe, not because she needed to build anything. She didn't need to build anything. The war was over and the ceasefire was holding, and nobody needed a fertilizer mortar. She just couldn't put it back down. She turned it over in her hands, felt the weight of it, thought about what it could do that it was not designed to do. She sat there for a long time. Then she found a piece of paper and a pen and she started writing a list. She didn't know what she was building. She just knew it should do something. She would figure out what. Adais was still in the yard at 2 o'clock. The thing on the ground in front of her was no longer recognizable as a bicycle. Most of it was still there, the frame, the wheels, the gears, but it was assembled differently now. The wheels were not where wheels were supposed to be. The frame had been supplemented with a length of wood from the pile near the fence, lashed in place with a piece of wire she had found near the gate. The gears were connected to something she was still working on, something that had no name yet because she didn't know yet what it was. Her friend Kofi came around the side of the fence and looked at it. What is that? He said. I don't know yet, Adai said. The same thing she'd said to her mother. Kofi sat on the wall and watched. He was the kind of friend who knew when to be quiet, which was one of the reasons Adais liked him. She worked for another hour. The thing began to look like something. Not finished, not even close, but like it was becoming what it was going to be. The shape of it settling. The pieces finding their places. Does it work? Kofi said. I don't know yet. Can I try it when it's done? Adais considered. When it's done, she said. She kept working. Outside the yard, the city made its noise. Vehicles and voices, and the distant sound of construction somewhere. Buildings going up. The afternoon light was the long kind, the light that came in sideways and made everything look like it was made of something warmer than it was. In the yard, a child built a thing from broken pieces and wire, without a plan, without instructions, without knowing what it was going to be until it became it. Nobody told her to. Nothing required it. There was no enemy, no shortage, no desperate situation. She had a full lunch in her stomach and a good house behind her, and a friend sitting on the wall watching. She just couldn't stop. Vreth Sen read her own report one last time the night before she retired. Not the official version. Her copy. The one with notes in the margins, the worn corners, the page 60, with the final paragraph that she had written in one sitting and never changed. She read it through. The whole 60 pages. The classification failures and the warehouse tables and the dishwasher and the core harvesting vehicle. The CROW framework. The ceasefire. The things she still didn't fully understand. She stopped at the last paragraph. Read it again. Do not go to war with them because they are afraid, and because their fear does not produce retreat, and because there is no lower limit to what they will use. She thought about a child she had never met and never would, building something in a yard on a planet 3 systems away. She thought about the 8 billion people on that planet, all of them carrying that reflex, that constant, unconscious, unkillable question about what things could do that they were not designed to do. She thought about what the galaxy would look like in 100 years. In 1,000. When those 8 billion became 20 billion. When the coalition became something larger. When the people who built weapons from kitchen appliances and farm chemicals became the people with the largest industrial capacity in the known systems. She thought about what they would build. Not weapons. Not only weapons. They would build everything, bridges and cities and ships and medicines and things that had never existed before because nobody had looked at the available materials and asked the right question until a human looked at them. She thought about the duct tape that Vrethon still had on his desk. She had heard about it from an aide, the grand tactician, the greatest military mind in the Dominion, keeping a roll of human adhesive tape on his strategy desk and working around it, and not quite being able to explain why. She thought about the word that didn't exist in the Dominion language, the word for a thing that gets more dangerous the worse its situation becomes. She thought about what word she would choose, if she were choosing. She didn't find one. Not in any language she knew. She closed the report. She turned off the light. In the morning she would carry her container out to the transport. She would go home. She would have, for the first time in 31 years, large amounts of unstructured time with nothing specific to analyze. She suspected she would find something to analyze anyway. She suspected she would look at what was available and find a use for it. She almost smiled at that. In the dark of her office, the last night in it. Almost. In the yard. At 3 in the afternoon, Adai sat back on her heels. The thing was done. Or done enough. It was never quite done. She already had 3 more ideas for it. Could already see the places where it could be better. But it was functional. It had a form. It did a thing. She looked at it. She didn't feel proud, exactly. She felt the way you feel, at the end of a long, good day of physical work. Clean inside. A little tired. Like something had been resolved. A question had been asked and answered. Does it work? Kofi said. For the second time. From the wall. Adaiza stood up, brushed the dirt off her knees, looked at the thing. Let's see, she said. She activated it. It worked. Not perfectly. It worked in the way that first versions of things work enough to know that the idea was right, that the principle was sound, that with adjustment and time it would become more than it currently was. It worked in the way that fertilizer in a pipe had worked on a rooftop on the 3rd day of an alien invasion, in the way that a wired backward sensor array had worked in a field at dawn, in the way that everything first works when someone asks the right question and the available materials say, yes. Kofi watched it and said nothing for a moment. Then, that's very strange. Yes, Adaiza said. I like it. Yes. She looked at it running. The parts of a bicycle that were not a bicycle anymore, assembled into a thing that hadn't existed this morning. She had made it from nothing, no, from broken things, which was different, which was better. Nothing was already nothing. Broken things were still something. Broken things still had materials. Broken things still had potential that hadn't been used yet. She had an idea for making it better. She could see it clearly. She picked up her tools. Kofi settled more comfortably onto the wall. Somewhere, in a report that she would never read, a line said, "We have no counter-doctrine for a species that considers fixing things a form of rest." In the yard, the afternoon light shifted. Adai's worked. She couldn't stop. None of them could stop. That was the whole point. That had always been the whole point.